Empathy is a thing that I've had to work at. I would say that I've always had empathy in the sense of like I could always tell when someone was upset and it bothered me that people were upset. But I think there's this macro empathy of really putting yourself in someone else's situation and recognizing the way in which the things that affect you affect them differently.
All right, everybody. I am so excited to introduce episode 2 of the Resilient Leadership Podcast. It is featuring a good friend and advisor of Mandala's, Kat Miller. I met Kat in 2022, almost 2.5 years ago, while she was serving as the CTO of Flatiron Health, a role she held for several years, from when it was a small company to eventually when it was acquired by Roche, and even a few years after. And when I first met Kat, I honestly had no idea that she managed a 400-person team, or she had built all these impressive products and services. I actually saw her as a human I wanted to connect with. And I think it's mainly for that reason that when push came to shove, I asked her to work with me more formally. She agreed to become an advisor to Mandala. It felt just so natural. And I think the conversation you'll hear with me and Kat, you'll get a sense of just how truly earnest of a human she is. And I'm a big fan of how she leads and how she manages. And I think the theme that I picked up on throughout the conversation, which I hope you pick up on, is the silent power of humility. When I reflect on Kat, I think about somebody who can look back at her first time managing, at her first time giving feedback, at her first time having a difficult conversation. And each of those times she can look at it with a lot of lightness, a lot of curiosity, a lot of introspection. And I think what allows her to get there is the ability to be selfless, the ability to actually be humble. And she may not actually acknowledge that verbally herself, but I see it in plenty throughout the conversation. So if you find yourself listening to this conversation and thinking to yourself, this is a CTO of a 400-person team and a leading digital health company, you wouldn't be the only one. That's how I feel most times I talk to Kat. One quick note is that she is no longer working at Flatiron Health. And this episode was recorded while she was at the company. But there's still so many lessons that are universal and that aren't dependent on her experience there, but are just more her opining. A final thing I'll share, and I'm a huge fan of this, is that she finds lessons from pop culture. You know, she reflected how during the pandemic, she used to watch Trevor Noah. She saw a Twitter thread with Sarah Silverman, and how she would learn lessons of management, not from some book by Michael Porter or some fancy article she read on HBR, but actually just watching people live their lives. And I find that to be so, so refreshing. On a very personal note, my wife is very similar. I always joke that my wife's wisdom is cereal box wisdom. She reads cereal boxes and discerns all kinds of deep truths from it. And I find that Kat has a very similar orientation. And so I'm a big fan of Kat Miller. You'll hear a lot more from her in the podcast series. We're going to try some fun little experiments together, analyzing modern cases of leadership. But for now, I want you to get a taste of who she is. And I think this awesome conversation that we ended up having does justice to that. So hope you enjoy it. And again, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, I'm at Tarun@mandalaforus.com. I hope you're enjoying this journey just as much as I am.
Kat, it is so wonderful to have you on the Resilient Leadership Podcast. I have gotten to know you somewhat well over the last few years and really appreciate all that you've done for Mandala, how you've shown up as a friend, as an advisor. I look forward to getting into some good conversation with you today. But I just want to ask, how are you? How is everything?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be here. And honestly, I'm just looking forward to getting to chat with you for an hour.
Well, that puts the bar relatively low, which is great for me. I tend to start here in my conversations with people, especially with you. I know we've talked a little bit about your background and your origin story. It's funny, you recommended a book on a blog that you wrote, and it is so much about a young person's development that I wonder if you could talk more either about the book that you recommended to me, or like what an origin story even means to you, why that matters, you know?
Well, the book is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. It's a fiction book. It's one of my favorite books that I've ever read. And I think the reason is that it feels like it was written about all the things in my life. So it has a woman who went to MIT, admittedly 10 years before I did. It has theater, like someone who did theater at Harvard, and I did theater at Harvard. It has video games, no spoilers, but they end up in different cities that I have lived in my life. So it's funny that it does feel like it's like a composite of all the things that Kat does and likes. I probably have changed how I think about origin stories over the years, because I think actually the things that end up feeling relevant are different at different times in my life. So I definitely think there are formative things about childhood that just like set your brain in certain ways. Certainly mine was privileged in some ways and not privileged in other ways. And those things definitely impact me a bit. I went to MIT, and I think that was an amazing experience for me. And I was very lucky to do so. And then, it's funny. Some of those things are really in sharp relief. And then there's a lot of kind of things in between that what comes up really depends on context. And so I'm not even sure, like in the intervening years,
There's a fascinating career trajectory that I'd love to explore in a second, but tell me more about the experiences you were talking about in childhood that you think still replay for you as you live your life. Like, what are some of those formative experiences? Were they with teachers? Were they with your parents? Were they in school, out of school? What is the array of experiences that come up when I say that?
Well, I think the backdrop is that we were economically poor. So like quite poor, I would say. But both my parents are super educated. So my dad was in a PhD program, which is part of why we were poor. And my mom was in med school, which is another part of why we were poor, which is a very, very different kind of experience than being in the same economic circumstances with a different set of careers or education around you. And so I think that was formative, both in, I think, some of the mentality that comes from not a economic scarcity at any point in your life, along with the experience of believing that school was like the most important thing. And it was like the ticket out of there, and being incredibly supported by, obviously my parents, but also my teachers in that. I think also my experience of being a woman in like math and tech was formed by that, because my experience, and this is very much about me and not about women in general, was I certainly was like the woman, the girl who was good at math. And I loved it. And I felt like I got a lot of attention for it and a lot of praise for it, more so than my male peers, including like my male peers who were as good or better than me. And for me, that was really positive. And it took actually a very long time.
How early was that? Was that like in middle school or high school or?
Yeah, definitely like 7th or 8th grade. I mean, it was early. Like I skipped a math grade pretty early, and then was on math team and all those things. There's like nerdy things that you care about a lot when you're like 14 years old.
Sure. Yeah. Congrats.
Yeah. It's definitely the coolest thing about me. Yeah. So it started pretty early. And it honestly, it took me a while to realize that combination of things that was really positive for me is actually really negative for other girls who are in the same experience. So I think things like that, where I got such a boost out of it, it was both a great experience for me, but also was something I kind of had to unlearn over time, that just because it worked for me doesn't mean that everyone else should appreciate it and want the same thing.
It strikes me, I think one thing that strikes me is you have this capacity to see your story and not fixate on it as the source of truth. Like, you have an awareness for other stories that may not linearly line up in the same way that yours does, or have the same generalizable conclusion that yours does. Is that something you've kind of always had, or is that something you developed? And talk me through that.
Absolutely something I developed. Empathy is a thing that I've had to work at. I would say that I've always had empathy in the sense of like, I could always tell when someone was upset, or and it bothered me that people were upset. But I think there's this macro empathy of really putting yourself in someone else's situation and recognizing the way in which the things that affect you affect them differently. And actually, like one of the moments, this is going to sound so strange, but one of the moments that this really crystallized for me, it was on Twitter, I think a million years ago. And Sarah Silverman, of all people, had tweeted something. I have no idea what it was. And someone had responded in trollish, vitriolic fashion, something nasty. Again, I don't remember what it was. And Sarah Silverman's response was basically, "I'm so sorry. It sounds like you're in a lot of pain. And I'm really sorry for that." To this mean comment. It was kind of like, "I hate you. I'm sorry your parents hurt you." Like one of those exchanges. And that didn't strike me as, that struck me as odd, but that didn't mean anything to me. But then I read the response from the troll poster, which was like a whole series of tweets about how unhappy, like how miserable they were, how hard, like the situations they'd been in, the pain they were in. And I was like, wow, this one moment of human connection unwound this person in a way that I never would have anticipated. In my head, this guy's a jerk, or who knows what gender they are, but this person is just a terrible human because they posted this, and a good human could never do that. And just watching the unspooling of that to realize, actually that nastiness came out of a place of pain, and it doesn't make me want to have dinner with that person. Right. But that was actually a really formative, like, oh, there's more going on under the surface.
What I love about that story is that it's not like you read some philosophy book or you went on a meditation retreat or you had a conversation with a coach. That it seems there's something powerful in the mundanity of it. Like you were reading a tweet thread and it expanded your sense of what empathy could look like. I think that's pretty cool. So I'm going to honor that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that because it was unexpected, because it contradicted my experience, but I was in a place, or the evidence was in front of me in a way that I could also accept it and start trying to process it.
Yeah. So Sarah Silverman's an interesting person you mentioned. I don't necessarily want to go deep into her background or her career, but I do want to know more about your career as it relates to acting. So you studied math. You grew up in an economically challenged circumstance. You went to MIT. Talk me through the jump from all of that into acting, which feels like you're landing yourself back in an economically uncertain experience, right? And it's a risk. So why did you do that? How did you do that?
Well, first of all, let me say, if you are considering an acting career, I highly recommend first having a computer science career. Because it turns out that you can work your own hours for much higher wage if you have that background. So certainly it was always clear that I was going to go to school for something that was a marketable service, a marketable skill. So that was never in doubt. And I never considered like going to Tisch for acting school or anything like that. It just wasn't at all on my radar. But I've been an actor in high school. I continued to do it in college. And then after college, I continued to do both community theater, but also at some point in the 2000s, Boston was giving a lot of tax incentives for films. And so I started doing like extra work, and I did independent films. And the experience of doing an independent film while working a full-time startup job is not one that I recommend.
Wait, this is after graduating you were doing
this
that?
This is after graduating. So this is like my mid-20s.
Oh, wow.
It's great. I mean, I worked with amazing people. I had a wonderful time. It was a very creatively fulfilling experience. It's also exhausting.
I know, I relate to that. Yeah.
And so I knew that I didn't think that doing both was sustainable. And so I wanted to try it. I was like, I know what path A looks like. I know what the computer science path looks like. Lots of examples of that one. I don't know what the path B looks like.
Did you have any friends that had become actors or actresses out of MIT? Is that a thing some people did?
It is not a thing. There was one person who I did not know personally, but I knew of, who was a couple years before me, who had done it, but not in a household name kind of way.
Yeah.
What actually did help is there was a guy named Chris Chula who is an actor, and ran a course that was called Actors to LA. And it like literally broke down, this is the stuff you have to do. And it was so helpful. It's like in those days, you have to get an LA phone number or you will not get called for jobs. You have to like your resume, needs to look this way. You need this kind of headshot. Don't get a friend to take a headshot. It has to look like this, here. And then like, here's what happens. You go out there, you do these things, you get enough credits, you get this kind of agent, honestly, it really is like a checklist, and not everyone goes through it linearly, but there really is a like progression and a like checkpoint thing that made it so much less scary to do than just, go out there and try to be discovered. I was working my way through a plan.
Yeah. Yeah. How did your parents react when you left? Because presumably at some point you left your tech career to go do this, right?
Yes.
Or were you doing,
I was doing both. I mean, I went from being a full-time employee to a contract employee working hourly. So certainly my income went down, but deeply grateful both that was something that they let me do, and also to have, that kind of rate card as a 27-year-old or whatever I was. My parents were not thrilled. I would say that one thing about me is I was bad at being a child because I didn't like having other people have agency over me. And so I have never been particularly interested in giving other people agency over me. So
Mm.
my parents were not thrilled, but also, did not get a say. And also,
Yeah.
I did it in a very responsible way. I had a
mean,
plan, I had a job, all that.
So I actually I haven't looked you up. Do you have an IMDb profile? Is there?
I do have an IMDb profile.
Can you tell us?
It's Cat Miller. It used to be Cat Miller 4. I don't know if it's still Cat Miller 4 or if it's a different Cat Miller, but it's got some very random stuff on it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess the reason I'm curious about that is there's so many dimensions about you, right? You have a side of you that can linearly engage with the world and go super deep into math. And then you have a side of you that can be very creative and can get into acting. Are there other sides that I'm missing, or are there parts of you that you think maybe aren't represented in our conversation right now that you're like, hey, there's one more side I've got to tell you about this person,
Interesting side, but it's something that it's like the physical side, the athlete side that I, as a nerd growing up, disdained physical activity. I didn't do group sports. I was very self-conscious. To be clear, this all came from being self-conscious and not, being comfortable with like catching a ball or.
Yeah.
So I definitely grew up with an image of myself as not an athlete. And it took me into probably my late 20s to realize like, oh, I build muscle really quickly. Like, oh, I can push myself to do things. And so while it's not maybe an intellectual part of me, I do think it is, it's one of those things that has become more important over my life. And maybe it comes back to having agency is, I do both have control of my body. I'm very lucky that my body has certain properties that makes it, relatively easy to do certain kinds of exercise. And that, I think being a physical person has become more important to me over my life rather than less. We'll see how that works going into my second half of my my life. But
yeah, no, and it's not. I think you actually assessed it yourself. There seems to be a thread line between the things you end up doing, or there's a desire for agency in whatever you've done. Is that your true north? Is that a value for you, and or like the thing that you aspire for?
Is it a value? I mean, it is a value in the sense of I can't live without it. Or it's the thing that that to put it less dramatically, it is a thing without which I am deeply unhappy. So it's something that I constantly seek. So when I think about money, for example, obviously I enjoy the things that money can bring, but most top of mind for that is economic security, ensuring that I always get control over where I live and who I live with, for example, is very, very important to me. I was thinking about values. Something that I talk about a little bit in like a talk that I give for folks who are joining my company is the difference between a value and a virtue. And I certainly don't think a need for autonomy is a virtue, but there's a difference between something that's like intrinsic and already exists and something you're constantly seeking. I have a need for autonomy, and so I'm constantly seeking it. But it's like inborn versus a value, which is something where I look at someone else and say, oh, that's a really good thing that they have, and I should build that more. Like empathy. Empathy was something that I really had to look at and say, this is important, and it's something I should try to develop in myself.
If you could give a 30-second version of that talk, what is the difference between a value and a virtue, and how might one think about that as they're entering the workforce, or whether it's your company or another one?
So what I talk about, and to be clear, I don't mean to say this is not absolute truth, but it's one way to think about it, is I talk about virtue as something that is expressed, that something that you see already expressed. So you might, look at yourself and say like, oh, I'm really good at, pushing myself to like go to the next level on things, or I'm really good at getting up in the morning or whatever. Like there are things that when you look at yourself, you say, oh, I like that about me. Or when you think about a company, I like that about the culture we've built. And that's a virtue. And you should recognize that. And I think it's important to name it and say, this is something I want to continue to be. And then a value is something that you think would make you better. And it might be something you have some of and you need more of. Maybe something you're not doing yet at all. But then values, I would say, are something where you believe it's something that would make you as a person, you as a company culture, it would improve your experience or your possibility of success. So that's like, it's a helpful distinction for me a little bit because, if you were to ask me like, what are your values? I would get a little stuck of like, what am I actually? And like, what do I want to be? Or what would I, what would other people say about me versus what would I want to say about myself?
That seems to be, I think, that's a very introspective way of approaching that conversation around values. I think there's like the aspirational you, and then there's the one that is more reflective of you and the choices you've made. right? And
Yeah.
I do think when we're talking about our values, we're somewhere in the mix. We're searching for something. Maybe it's something we already have. I know for me, I feel like most of it is aspirational because it tends to be something that I want to emulate and I want to be that. So that makes sense. Uh, we've kind of covered a good amount of ground about your background and the things that have informed your experience set. I guess whether they're virtues or values, how do you think about the values you carry into the workplace? So, empathy seems to be one of them. Tell me
Yeah.
about the others. Maybe go in on empathy. What are the values that that sort of define you?
I think the virtues that I have that, and I want to like say that in a way that's like, I don't know that I've worked for them. I think they're just things that are me. I think honesty is one. And I think that comes from being a bad liar. Like there are people who are able to, given a direct question, say something that is not the truth. And I really can't without thinking in advance. So I tend to be a pretty honest leader, including saying things like, I can't give you the answer to that, or like, that's not a thing I'm willing to talk about, instead of kind of giving a different answer. And I'm pretty transparent, which I think is a related but slightly different virtue. And that's because I like problem solving with other people. And so if I keep all the information to myself, I don't get any problem solving partners. And so it's, again, easier for me to try to share that information. And obviously the level of detail and what you share with different people as appropriate is not the same across the board. But those are two things that I think are, if you were to ask people I work with, I think those are things that they would say. And I think of them as like, I'll call them virtues, things that exist because I almost don't have a choice about it, or because I need those things to exist. And then when I think about things that I reach for, things that I want to be, things that I admire in others and try to bring in, I definitely think about empathy. Like I said, it's an ongoing, very active attempt to, whenever I'm, especially whenever I'm pissed off about something, to say, wait, where is this coming from? What was going on that led to this? Because especially in the workplace, very few humans come in to work saying, I want to be a bad person and make other people's life worse. There's usually, there's a reason that things go wrong. And it may or may not be a reason that, is one that we can continue forward with. But so that's something that I think is really important to me. And I do think the Sarah Silverman was like the genesis of it. But obviously I've seen over time also people grow, right? So this is, I think, a common experience for managers is you kind of don't realize that feedback really works until the first time you see someone turn around something that you thought was an innate feature of them. Like that someone who was, for example, like very combative, and over time they get feedback from you and others. And then later on you get feedback that they're really collaborative. You're like, wow, that's a thing that can happen. I think that's part of the same thing. So we've talked about empathy. I think another one that's, I don't know if it's a value per se, but bringing humor and like lightening the mood and making it easier to connect. I had a boss very early on who's like one of the funniest humans I've ever met. Like, should have been a stand-up comedian kind of person. And early when I was working with him, we were working on something. I think we were trying to stand up like a Tomcat instance, and it was going badly. And he just kept cracking jokes. And it really changed something that could have been, I'm a relatively new employee. I like can't figure this tech thing out. Like could have been really negative, and just turned it into like, this is okay. This is a thing that's happening. And it didn't make me feel like, oh, it's okay to be terrible at your job. It just made the circumstance easier. And so I'm a big believer in diffusing with humor, especially obviously, self-deprecating humor, or humor that punches at me rather than someone else. And I think it serves well in a lot of uncomfortable conversations, especially kind of group settings where you need to break the ice somehow.
Yeah. You always hear that person on that group call that makes that first joke, and then the whole room lightens up. It's funny you say this. I was listening to another podcast, and actually it was Dan Harris is 10% Happier. And he was talking about how when his son complains or talks about something, one of the strategies he's trying to employ is he just starts singing the thing that his son says in a song. And it's a very bizarre response, but in a weird way, it has the effect of like helping you defray the conviction of the sticky, sad, frustrating experience you're having. I was doing it yesterday with my partner. I asked her to sing something with me. We were complaining about something, and it was just, we were laughing and singing, and it added levity. So there's ways of trying to be funny, even if comedy isn't your first step. It is, I think, an understated value. It is pretty cool when you can do that.
I love that. And I actually think, you brought up kind of the partnership relationship. I actually think I do the same thing when I'm in the wrong. Like, not to say that it's okay for me to be in the wrong, but it's one way for me to like acknowledge that I did something that wasn't great and apologize for it without making it a big thing, is to sort of make fun of myself for it.
I don't know whether you want to label it as a virtue or a value, but one thing that I think strikes me about you is you're very down to earth. And I think your approachability, your openness to talking about yourself, your openness to even making a joke about yourself, there's a way in which I feel you don't take yourself too seriously, and you're able to actually kind of make other people feel more comfortable, given that that's something that you have. So I don't know if you want to add that to your list, but I think it is definitely a virtue. It may or may not be a value, just from having observed and worked with you. Let me know if you think that's right or wrong.
I appreciate that. I think maybe it's just always being aware that I'm a work in progress. I mean, we all are, but I just hopefully I'll be a better person tomorrow.
Yeah, but even that, right? So, I mean, you mentioned one manager that they used kind of humor. Tell me about others that kind of shaped you. Was there one that was like extraordinarily empathetic? Because I've heard you talk about that. Or what are the others? What have they been like?
I've had pretty universally great managers. I think something that's for me that's interesting about being really close to a person, as I am with managers that I've reported to for years, and I think most of my managers I've been fortunate to have many year relationships with, is I feel like I stole ideas and techniques from them. Like how to open a meeting, how to have a one-on-one, how to give bad news, how to like shut down inappropriate conversation. But when I think about like maybe like the more generic like role model style, or like if I think about something as big as empathy, I actually tend to veer towards like more like public figures. And I think that's because with a public figure, you only see that side of them. So it's easy for them to kind of embody that. Whereas you work day in, day out with someone, you can absolutely say like, this is a super empathetic person who does all these things, but you also just like know a little bit more about how the sausage was made. And so for me, when I think about, things that impacted my leadership, for example, like very weirdly, I actually think about, I'm not actually that into comedians, but this is going to be another comedian example. I think about watching Stephen Colbert and Trevor Noah at the beginning of the pandemic. So in the middle of 2020, we're all locked down. They're doing shows from their homes, and they're clearly not okay. Like they are not handling it great, but they are willing to let other people see them not handle it great on TV. And I found that first at the time very comforting. Like it was so cathartic to see other people responding to the same things that I was experiencing and to see their reactions. And then I also think it gave me a model for vulnerability that I could finally relate to, because as a woman, you get, vulnerability is something that you're told is it's a woman's strength, like lean into it. And I think it is a strength. I think it's a human strength. But I needed to see it modeled in a way that you can be vulnerable and not lose your strength. And I think like those were actually good examples of people who were doing their best, being very honest about the fact they were doing their best, and actually, I think, creating great content and doing like a service for the world at the same time.
Well, I think two things you said there. One is, it is true that public figures, and maybe they do benefit from you not being so proximate to the mechanics of what they do. They do allow us to see models of values that we can learn from and imbibe from. I was going to actually say, for me, similar to you, I got a lot of my values just observing, at least at a certain time in life, political figures run for office, share their stories, connect with the broader population, seem so down to earth and earnest. In a way, it felt like the best versions of them could raise us as a population because they were able to connect with us. I do think comedians have actually played that role for us. I don't think you're off base there. like the value of Stephen Colbert or Trevor Noah during a dark time in America is so powerful. And we do feel some kind of relational connection to them. And so it makes sense that they become kind of a muse in some ways. What about the manager though? I want to go back to that. Like, did you ever have an experience with a manager where you're like, like this is going to change when I manage eventually, this is going to change how I work with people? You mentioned some mechanical things they did, which you can get into, but if there's even one that you can spotlight, I'd love to know.
Well, it's interesting because I think I absorb the good things by osmosis. Like you get treated well year over year, you get treated with respect, and that becomes the basis for how you treat others, right? So I definitely think that all of my managers laid that foundation. And it doesn't have the same ping as the time that I realized that I didn't love the fact that my manager responded to everything with a coaching question. Like that, it's an interesting, this is to be very clear, this is a human psychology thing, I think. But like, I think that everything that I absorbed from my managers that makes me a good manager, I did it over years of just experiencing positivity, experiencing them praising things that I did that did well, experiencing them having good feedback conversations when I did, when there were opportunities for me to grow. And the things I remember, or the things that like got absorbed differently, was when there was something that was like a little bit out of kilter. And I was like, oh, I don't like that. And like, so I think I actually am grateful to all of them for both kinds of things. And so, and the most specific examples I can give are the ones where like, in a sea of great, like one thing was like, oh, that was rough. I will say I can think of one piece of feedback that I got, which was very like impactful and has kind of stayed with me, which is that there was a moment I was sort of on vacation, but not really, because I don't know, and I was being grouchy. I was being grouchy on Slack, very visible to my team. I was being grouchy about something. And my manager Slacked me and she's like, hey, if you need to take a vacation, you should take a vacation, because your mental state is the team knows when you are not feeling well, or like when you are upset. And that's all she said. Like she didn't go on, like she didn't give me a huge lecture. It was over Slack. So it wasn't like but that was like such a good way. And I like basically have used that for other people as well. That was such a good way to give me a piece of feedback that was so much more effective than a lecture. And so that's something that like still sticks in my mind, both for that feedback, but also for the like timely, like just slide it in way that she managed to sort of course correct me.
Yeah. I have this phrase. Actually, I don't know if this phrase directly applies to what you're saying, but there's a phrase that I've been using a lot, which is like cereal box wisdom, which is we learn way more from like the back of a cereal box than we do like a self-help book. And I think what you're sharing with me aligns in that you're learning a lot more from the people you're working with in the more subtle ways they're behaving and the more subtle attributes they're exhibiting, more so than any declaration that they're giving or like any singular formative moment between you and them. And I think there's a thread line between that and the Sarah Silverman thing, where learning in that mechanism it makes you feel like you can be a learner throughout. Like even this conversation can be a source of learning. Like every moment can surprise you or awaken you in some way. That's what I'm drawing from you, Kat. Tell me if you think that's off, but that's how I'm seeing you.
100%. I think that time has only made me like a more open person. I definitely used to have like a closed, fixed mindset, a fixed growth mindset. I used to think, I'm as good as this thing as I'll ever be, and that's it. And I think like the older I get, the more open I get to the idea that it's just an additive experience of life. It's more fun that way too.
Yeah. So you're now the CTO of Flatiron Health, right?
Yeah.
Talk me through that. How big is your team? That seems like a huge role. What is that like for you?
Yeah. So Flatiron Health is about, I guess, maybe 1,200 people in total. My team is the tech team. So it's software engineering and security and data science and IT. And that is a team of about 400 people. And I mean, it's incredibly rewarding. I'm very lucky. I mean, I'm always aware of how lucky I am. And it's kind of in these subtle ways. Like I know that I am in a place that thinks about humans first, like every company has to think about dollars. Dollars are important. Like you're in business. Business is a thing. I think I would struggle to function at a place that did not also remember that we are impacting human lives, both in the products we make and in the decisions we make around our employees and how we treat people, both, as leaders, and then also what we tolerate in terms of interpersonal relationships day to day. And so I both love my job because I have amazing colleagues and my team surprises me every day with what they're able to accomplish, but also because, I get to do it in a space where I don't feel like I'm fighting basic battles about human dignity. And that's really important to me.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, like, you manage essentially a third of the company. You, in some ways, do you feel responsible for how a third of the company operates or works with each other? Like, what's the sense of responsibility that you experience when you think about the role you have?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm obviously accountable for it, right? I'm accountable for delivery. I'm accountable for the culture, the norms. Like I'm accountable for all of it. And I don't do very much of it, right? Like I personally do not deliver the products. I personally don't do don't set the architecture. So I think what's really interesting is it's a little bit more the role of a conductor, where there are specific moments where I might have to come in and say like, no, we don't do this way. And then it's a lot of like nurturing and encouraging the things that I think are going really well and trying to figure out and problem solve the things that aren't going well. So it's a strange experience of like, everything is my fault. Of course it is. I'm responsible for all of it. And I maybe this is why I feel grateful. I am grateful that it's an org that I can be proud of because I feel like that's not just about me. That's about everyone else who shows up every day.
Yeah. I wonder, as you think about coaching or working with other people, how you support yourself, because I want to know a little more about that, because there's probably a voice in your head that's critical of you. I know we've talked about the inner critic. Talk me through what the inner critic of a CTO is like. What are some of the animated things that they're telling you? How much ever you're willing to share?
I mean, my inner critic acts like watching myself on a movie screen, right? So it replays a conversation and it's like, did you do a good job? Like, would I like that line of dialogue? Is that, but I think what's interesting and what helps me is it depersonalizes a little bit. So when I do something that is like not good, where I genuinely feel like I have messed up, I feel very bad about it. And I tend to like retreat away from it. When I do something that I could have done better, I think it's actually relatively easy for me to say, okay, like I'm watching that on the movie screen and that could have gone better, but to not make it's more like the person playing the role of Kat, the CTO, could have handled that conversation in a slightly better way, or could have avoided that swirl if she had done something else. And it doesn't feel like Kat, messed up.
Is that something you again, is that a virtue, or did you evolve that?
What's interesting is now I really want to hear like what yours is like and what other people's is like, because I think this is like a pretty inherent self-defense mechanism. Right. Maybe like a really simple way to describe it is when I lived in LA and when I was working as an actor, the way I thought about my body was as a product. So I very much was like, I will get more roles if I am, this weight. I will get more roles if my skin is clearer, and for me, and again, this is only about me and not about other people, that was actually a healthy distance, because it wasn't like, oh, you're a bad person because you ate a brownie. It was like, okay, there's a trade-off here in terms of, what you want what your body product is going to look like to people, and the fact that you want a brownie. And so it depersonalized it in a way that didn't feel like, oh, it's me. It made it feel like, oh, this is a thing I have, again, agency over, that I can control. And so like that's always been, I guess, a part of me that's probably developed more over time. But I'm curious, like, are other people totally different?
No. I'll tell you. I think your inner critic and your relationship with your inner critic, if I were describing it openly, I would say it's a healthy relationship you have. it doesn't strike me as one that's personalizing everything or that's catastrophizing everything. You don't sound like you're necessarily even ignoring things you could have done better. It feels very human, like the way you're describing it, and it feels grounded in agency. I was reflecting, there's a separate mental health leader, Paul Conti, he's a psychiatrist, and his whole argument is that mental health boils down to agency and gratitude. That's like one of his main findings. And he finds that people that actually focus on getting agency in their life, and it sounds like that's something that's been a sort of underlying thread for you, they do find themselves more resilient to hardship, to experiences, because it's not as if they assume they're powerless or they're helpless. And and it's also something that there's a sense that they can do something about it, right? I would argue that the majority of people who are walking into the workplace now, who are maybe 22, or people that are just starting off with their careers that don't have this as something they've been working on their whole life, have a different relationship to their inner critic, where they feel like every failure is their failure. And I'll speak to mine. When I mess something up today, it's a little different because I'm so mired in this work. But there's versions of me that were younger, 10, 15 years ago, that if I made a mistake, I would have felt like it was a colossal reflection on my character. Or if someone gave me negative feedback, I would feel like they're talking about me as a person. It took me years to sort of unwind that. I don't even know if I'm perfect at it yet, So my inner critic may not be yours, but I do think there's something interesting in examining that voice and asking that voice what it needs and where it comes from. I'll pause. Anything come up for you after I said that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it makes sense. I think two things. One, I do still have like the sticky stuff that I don't touch. A lot of it's like from childhood. Like I just, I'll remember a thing I did that was like, just like, why did you do that? And it's still like, and I still don't want to think about it. I still shy away from it. So I absolutely like want to be very clear. I have those like little like bad moments in me for sure. Yeah, so that's really interesting. I had another thought, but I've totally lost it
because I was just thinking. We'll come back.
I was thinking about the bad moments, and I was like, I don't want to live in the bad moments.
Fair enough, but you can feel free to share a more contemporary example or an example from your career. Talk to me about a time when the outer critic was very visible. Maybe there was a tough conversation you had to have or that happened to you, or something that was just a real setback. What was that like? I don't want to say the word failure, but if it felt like one, talk me through that.
So I'll say two things. One is like, I do think that on the small ones, when you can apologize, like you can't fix it, but when you can apologize and say, I messed up, for me anyway, that gives me a ton of closure. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe I should take it more to heart. But if I treat someone in a way that when I look back on it, I'm not happy with, or if I make a mistake, like having the ability to apologize is huge for me in terms of feeling better about it and making it not a sticky spot.
Can I ask you about real quick on that? Do you reflexively apologize, or do you think and then apologize what does an cat apology look like?
In the way I'm thinking, it's a thinking and apologizing. So sometimes I'll come home and I'll be like, was I dismissive of that person in that meeting? Or like, was I, it can be little stuff, right? Like, did I not make it clear that was that person's idea? And as soon as I think it, I'll send off like a Slack apology. So sometimes it's just like, it takes time to recognize. It's usually thoughtful and it's usually after the fact. I will apologize in the moment if I realize that I've done something wrong in the moment. But often it's not a reflexive. It's like, ooh.
Yeah.
I could have done better.
So I know sometimes I'll reflect. I'll just be like, hey, that was my bad. And I'll be like, wait a minute. What was bad about that? Can we sit with that for a second? And it takes me some time to unpack it. And then I'll reach out and have a much more longer conversation about it. I'm like, hey, actually, I sat with it. I don't want to just tell you I was bad. So yeah, sorry, continue. I'd love to hear about an example of
so I have my biggest example. Another thing I'm reflecting through this all is like, my experience is that all of this gets easier the better your circumstances are. So I do think all of this is easier when you obviously have a good economic situation, when you're being told that you're great all the time. Like, this is easier. I had an example a number of years ago where I got feedback during a performance review that to me at the time felt new. It felt a little unfair. and it felt like hearsay. Like it felt like I was getting feedback that was, so and so doesn't like working with you, but without like anything kind of behind it, and also not what I had heard from the person. And I definitely spun around it. I like considered quitting my job. Like it was not a healthy response. Let's be very clear. It was not a mature, healthy response.
Yeah.
What I had to do in that case was honestly get other opinions, because I needed someone to explain it to me in a way that made sense to me. And so there were a couple things, like I had one conversation where I learned that like one of the pieces of feedback that I thought was really unfair, I like learned more about the person who gave it. And I was like, okay, yeah, that was really unfair. That person's had something else going on, and that wasn't about me. Honestly, like that was part of it. Like I needed to like sift what was going to be true for me. But then also I was like fortunate to talk about this with a couple people who then pointed me to examples again in real time where a behavior that I did made someone feel disrespected or like not included. So like the one that sticks in my mind is there was a meeting on my calendar. It had like a title. It had like a very light agenda. And I showed up at the beginning. I was like, okay, great. So I read the agenda and here's what I think we should do. And then like 15 minutes into the meeting, I realized that agenda was not accurate. And like, that's not what that meeting was about. That's not what anyone else wanted to talk about. But I just like bowled over.
How did
didn't give
you have
space
like,
for anyone.
did you have like that sinking feeling that people weren't reacting? Like, how did you realize that?
I think what's interesting is the way I just said it, it seems like, oh, wow, like it must have been like a lead balloon. It wasn't, because it wasn't so far off. So it like took a while to be like, oh, I see. This wasn't about where the team was going to land. This was about what we were going to do about this other thing.
Yeah.
And so the thing, I mean, for me, the thing I had to reconcile was that my inner experience of it was not the same as other people's outer experience of it. And I had to learn that this is, when I do this, it's perceived this way.
How do you not take that personally? Like, I feel like if I were there's a side of me that would be like, you know what? F you. Here I am doing my best job. Like, why do I have to empathize with you? How guide me on how I would take that less personally?
I mean, let's be clear. I was very pissed about this feedback. Like, I was not happy.
Okay. Yeah.
But I mean, but that's kind of why I needed the other people. Like, that's why I needed to be told it from a bunch of different perspectives, right? One, it turns out that the way it was written originally wasn't going to get through to me like that, because it made some assumptions about what was going on and I was rejecting it. But I needed to hear a couple other people say something more of the form of like, no, I don't think you're hard to work with, but I think that, first of all, like explaining to me a little bit about like where other people might be coming from. And when when you think you're right about this thing, it like doesn't matter that you're right. You didn't give anyone else a chance to be right about it. Like you're not giving space for other people. And I had to hear it a couple of different ways. And so I don't know, maybe my recollection is wrong, that it wasn't personal for me by the end of it. But I resented this, and my first reaction was I'll just smile more. And guess what? It turns out smiling more did help. And then I was like, well, see, this was dumb gendered feedback, because I smiled more and it fixed it. But you know what? When you smile, you behave differently and people respond differently.
Yeah. Something fascinating there. And again, I want to say the fact that you're so willing to share that example, be so human and humble about that. It is not like a leading common indicator of most CTOs. I think you have the capacity to sort of see yourself as a character and take it lightly. And I find that to be a very like appealing character out of a leader. I think that's a very strong leadership quality. I am curious if you can opine more broadly about resilience in the workplace. A company like Flatiron, or most companies, will experience work from home, hybrid work back in the office, anxieties, like mass pandemic related anxieties, layoffs. There's been a number of seismic changes at the company, even that you've probably witnessed. What does resilience mean in that context? What does it mean for a leader? The floor is yours.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it comes back to this kind of fundamental theme of like self-awareness and acceptance, and maybe this idea of like iterating towards being better. A lot of the, it's been a very eventful few years, as you just said. And I think for different leaders, different parts of it were hard. During the early phase of the pandemic, it wasn't hard in the sense that I didn't know what to do. It was just like people were feeling bad and I needed to be there for them. And that felt very obvious as a thing to do, to be there to listen. Recent years, our economic climates have changed. And so I and most CTOs are facing sort of different expectations from our boards, from our CEOs and our other stakeholders around things like costs. And that's a pretty big pivot. And it's all iteration. It's all a learning experience. And it's not, some days are harder than others. Yeah. Like some days I don't feel great. Yeah. I did not feel great when we laid people off, and that, nor should I have, right? Yeah. But I do think, I think at the core, what resilience means is that you are able to handle change and disruption, because change and disruption is the norm. It is like what you should expect. And as a leader, all the more so, because I think it's very normal for my CEO or my CFO or whatever to walk into my room and say, hey, here's some news about the industry, or here's some news about our finances, or here's something I need you to move on really fast that's totally different from what you were expecting. And you have to be able to get your head around it and roll with it.
In those circumstances where things are completely outside of your control and you have to be a decision maker, I imagine like one of the things that probably helps you, just from work we've done together at Flatiron, is the capacity to like pause for a moment versus just immediately reflexively take X and then move into Y and Z. How do you think about pausing? Is that valuable to you? What do you do to create that moment?
Well, I think, and this is something I've only kind of realized, talking to you and working with Mandala, is that part in that smile more phase, once I got past smile more, I got to listening first.
Wait, by the way, did someone actually tell you to smile more, or was that like literally feedback? Okay.
No. I thought the feedback was gendered, and so I was like, I will just try smiling more.
And it worked, yeah.
And it worked, but it didn't stop at smile more, in the sense that what it also ended up being was listening first. So just find out, make sure you understand what this conversation is about or what this person wants. It's like negotiation 101, listen first. And I think the pause is the extension of that, which is, CEO comes in and says, I don't know, something catastrophic, hey, we need to up production by 50%, or we need to cut costs by 50%. I think there was a time in my life that I thought the reasonable answer was to argue and to give all the reasons that it wouldn't work. And that's very natural, but it's actually not that productive. And so I think the pause and the gathering, and for me, the figuring out, what is the next question? Like, I'm not ready to respond to this. I don't have an answer. What is the next question? How do I start gathering more information? And how do I use this person who's giving me this thing as a thought partner for my first steps about like, what should I do? Because I think the other thing is, I used to think it was all on me. I thought, person is bringing me a problem. It is my job to solve it. Turns out most of the time, the person bringing you the problem has some thought about how to solve it, which you may or may not agree with, but you should probably find out.
Listen to. Yeah. Yeah. There's, it's funny that you said arguing back felt like the most obvious response. When we talk about stress education, the 4 responses people usually say: fight, flight, flee, or fawn. There are different versions of you that burst out in different of those moments. I feel like your own awareness around that is so key. Like, that that's a version of you that used to come up. Now you're listening more. It sounds like that's been helpful. What about the part about you, like part of you that needs to have a difficult conversation with somebody where things are just not working out? Like, what advice do you have for managers that are like, gosh, the idea of getting a difficult conversation wrong makes me squirm. I don't want to do this. This is not my thing. Or they're like, I'm just going to tell it like it is, Kat. I don't know how to sugarcoat. I don't want to be like this evolved higher than thou manager. I'm just who I am. So deal with it. So I want you to talk about those two extremes and what guidance you would give around that.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. Okay. One is actually, I remember my manager at one point said that she was trying to have a difficult conversation every day. That like she felt good at the end of the day if she had one difficult conversation. And when she told me that, I was like, whoa, I can't live that way. But actually, I respect it a lot, because it means that you're not shying away from things that are hard. And to be clear, in this context, I don't think difficult conversation necessarily has to be with a direct report that's underperforming, but it's, and I think this is the role of a leader, is like, where is their stuckness? Like, where do you sense that there is a difference of opinions? A blocker. Yeah. Like where do you think there's something that needs to be talked out? And so one, I love that idea of like, can you have a difficult conversation every day is like a really good goal that I do not do, but I think it's a great thing to think about. Two, I do think they get easier when you do more of them. So it's like any other muscle. Like when you're doing it every day, you're just like, well, this is the hard conversation of the day. And the skill is just kind of there. I think they are still hard. Like there are certain kinds of hard conversations that I'm good at. Like when it's two teams that are duking it out, I can go in, I can, talk to them both reasonably and figure out what's going on and like get to the bottom of it. When it's a direct report that's like, hey, this did not go the way it should have, I still have to do a lot of preparation, think about, really try to get to an outcomes-based set of feedback rather than an I wouldn't have done it that way feedback. Get comfortable with the fact that some of it's not going to be perfect. But ultimately, remember that the worst thing you can do is to not have the conversation. That is unfair to you and your organization.
Yeah, that's really powerful. That's a great set of steps that one can take, right? You're preparing, you're trying to think of an actionable thing that comes out of that preparation. You're trying not to avoid it, and you're just going to engage, and knowing that it's not going to be perfect. That, I think, perfectionism can be such a disease in that space because it can prevent you from engaging. It feels like one thing you're doing, Kat, is it feels like you're focused on what you control. It doesn't feel like you're obsessed with their experience of how they receive your feedback. Like if someone said, Kat, I disagree, or they take it very personally, or they just don't handle it very well, it seems like you have the capacity to say, I'm doing whatever I can. I cannot control how they receive it. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it still sucks because you're like, well, where are we going from here?
Yeah.
But my experience of being a manager was like my first year as a manager, I was terrified that I was all my employees were going to come to me and tell me that they were quitting. Like I was really scared of my people quitting because they weren't happy.
Yeah.
And then someone quit, not because they weren't happy, because they wanted to go make art. And I was like, oh, this isn't so bad. So I guess part of it is also, for me anyways, it's just reps. I think my team is amazing. I hope they stay with me. But it's not all about me. And it's not even all about Flatiron necessarily. And so I think that's, I think the only way that I got there was enough reps of like seeing it and being like, oh, I see, this isn't, there's nothing, I don't control these humans and I shouldn't try.
I want to go deeper into difficult dialogue. The thing that I've heard from just our research, what we're seeing is that about 74% of managers are afraid of Gen Z. They're afraid of managing Gen Z. They're afraid of how Gen Z will react to how they present themselves. Where do you think that's coming from? / do you have any advice to that group of people that feel that way? Maybe you feel that way. How do you think about this next generation?
That's so interesting. I mean, let's be clear that I don't directly manage any Gen Zers because folks I'm managing are more like VP level, which would be very impressive. That's so interesting. I mean, I don't love generational warfare or sweeping generalizations. Things I have noticed over time, younger folks are less likely to read their emails regularly, which is infuriating to us old timers. And I do think that the expectation around like career advancement has gotten more aggressive over time. And I think for both better and worse, I think that younger generations have gotten an empowerment message that means that they want to advocate for themselves. They want to make sure that they're not taken advantage of. And again, broad sweeping generalizations that sometimes are a little bit based in kind of like old school culture. Like if you were at IBM in the 1970s, like this level of negotiation for your salary is reasonable. But for example, at our company, we don't give counter offers. So if you go out and you get an offer for somewhere else and you're like, well, I'm going to leave if you don't give me more money, we're like, okay. I mean, we'd love you to stay, but do your thing. Which I think is like, it's almost like a value. It's like we don't want to be, you get to make your own decisions. We're not going to be held hostage to what money you can make elsewhere. Like you should make good decisions for yourself. So none of this is, so kind of coming back to the Gen Z question, I think there are tendencies that are stronger in the younger generation, but I mean, I also see a lot of ambition and a lot of like self-startingness in folks that we hire at the generation. So I certainly don't have that aversion.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't have a generational preference. Like even if it was legal to talk about, I don't have a generational preference.
Yeah, no, I don't think you, I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do you counsel a junior manager when they come and tell you, Kat, you know, things have just changed. To this next generation is just not what we were like. People thought millennials were bad, but we're better than Gen Z. Like, how do you handle something like that?
I mean, I do, you know, fundamentally I have questions about, do structures need to change? So like, here's a thing that's been a pain forever and I think is going to get worse, which is engineering ladders. So when I graduated, there were there were a couple companies with ladders for sure. Microsoft had existed forever with ladders, but
what's a ladder? Can you explain what a ladder is?
Yeah, sorry. A career ladder is like a set of progression. It's like what your promotions are. So you start at, let's say, like a level 1, and by manager level, you'd be level 5. So you climb a ladder, and that's what promotions are. And I think having a ladder implicitly means that people want to climb it.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real tension between sort of recognizing that there are experiential differences between someone who's had a wealth of different technology experiences and leadership experiences. I think that it's very uncomfortable, and I'm uncomfortable with it too, to say like, hey, you are a great engineer. Like, you are doing these kinds of tasks really well, but you haven't had like a certain breadth of experience, for example. And so the fact that ladders exist to be climbed, but in any company, there's sort of a finite number of rungs, and certainly a finite number of like people who can exist at the top rungs is I think an inherent challenge that has existed for a long time and is probably going to get worse as with sort of generational shift. So one answer I would say is like, I do think that I as a leader want to know places where are like, where are the pain points? Like, where is the friction? Like, let's get specific about where the friction is.
Right.
And
not just talking generalities or statistics. Yeah.
Like, where are our tools not serving us? And I guess the other thing is like, it's a person. It's a human being in front of you who is at the start of their career journey. Hopefully they're coachable. You know, coach them. They don't have to think like you, and they certainly don't have to like have all of it together right away.
Yeah.
Everyone who's new in their career, you know, some people intuitively get things more, but I think that actually it's really important to like help them see explicitly things. Like if they're, I think maybe one thing that's going on here is like, you know, it's always easier to manage people who are like you, who just like understand the subtext of it. And I think it's really important to be explicit with folks who aren't getting the subtext about what you're looking for and why. So like, hey, I expect you to come to work every single day. And I expect you to not miss meetings that are in the morning that you have agreed to. Right. It sounds like I shouldn't have to say that. And a lot of people my age would be very, very pissed to have to say it.
Yeah.
But you should only have to say it once. But maybe you do actually have to say it.
I think what you're really getting at is like, get proximate to the specific gaps that are happening and be as specific to those gaps as possible, as opposed to speak in some sort of general term. And even if it feels hilariously stupid to say those gaps, right? Explaining them can only help you and help them. It can align expectations. Yeah, that makes sense. There's another data article you sent me a few weeks ago, Kat, saying managers control 69% or they have the most impact on someone's mental health, equivalent to their spouse, that's like the most amount in our time. Where do you think that's coming from? What does that mean for a manager today?
First of all, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Like the idea that you can have so much impact. I mean, it's empowering, but it's also terrifying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I take it as a big responsibility. And to me, my first reaction to that article is like, wow, it's really important to have two-way communication because, you know, I need my people to have space to say what's working for them and what's not. And sometimes, you know, I can't fix everything that's not going well in their job. Like, I'd love to, I can't. But, you know, they're really, I would hate to find out after the fact that I was the reason that someone was like stressed all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky the people I've worked with for a long time. I feel, very comfortable with them, but it's really a good reminder that like you really have to keep it two ways, because it's one thing if I'm intentionally generating stress because things are bad and I need results, but to unintentionally be causing harm, which I think is probably what's happening in a lot of these cases, is just unacceptable. And so like when we come back to values, I think a fundamental value for me is I want to be a positive impact on lives. Like I want most people who meet me to think neutrally of me or feel like I was someone that was a positive impact. And so that is a guiding light for me.
Yeah, no, I can tell. And I think that is a great note for future managers to remember. They have an impact, and that success actually can mean executing really well on projects, but it could also mean not harming the people that work with you, because you don't want to necessarily have that hanging over you. I have one last category of questions, then a rapid fire, and then we'll close it out. But my last category, Kat, is what about the manager that sees something where things don't work out for them? Like they have a product that they wanted to roll out and it gets botched. They have a customer that's really upset at them and they have to go and deal with it. And there's nothing they can do to change the circumstance. How does a manager look at a failed outcome and respond from that? Is there any experience you can draw from personally, professionally? How do you think they should respond? How do you think they might respond to failure?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that it's not going to feel good. Like there's no world in which you're going to have your best day on that day when you find out that the customer is pissed or like that, things are going poorly. Like it's just not going to be good.
Definitely true.
So like, right. I think you said it before, which is you can only control what you can control. I think a thing that is part of why empathy hasn't always been easy for me, but it is also part of why I'm able to compartmentalize, is that even as soon as you kind of started talking about the scenarios, I was like, well, what are you actually going to do? Like what can actually be done in this circumstance? And for me, and it may not be everyone's response, that focusing on what can even happen here? Like what are the outcomes that we can affect?
Yeah.
Is it about a postmortem to ensure it doesn't happen again? Is it about managing the relationship with the customer? Is there something to salvage here? For me, and this is what I would coach someone on, just because it gets them out of their head a little bit, is great. That thing you wanted, that's not happening. Like that thing's not launching, that customer is not signing. Where do we go from here? And I can also tell you that as a leader, that's a really mature response from someone to get the like, this thing didn't happen. The postmortem on like what went wrong and like the pivot of where are we going and the recommendation. That's going to read as a better, a more mature response.
Yeah.
The other thing I think about is, I can't remember the book, but there's a book that talks about, maybe it's The Power of Moments, that talks about when things go wrong, it's actually an opportunity to, like, you can impress someone more when things go wrong than when things go right.
Yeah.
So like the hotel that screws up your reservation, but then like responds to that by upgrading you to the penthouse suite, has much more opportunity to like get in good with you than when everything just went fine and you got your room and everything was okay.
It's a beautiful example, actually. Yeah, it's a good example.
So I would also think about that. It's not an in the moment thing. I think it's very hard to think about that in the moment, but maybe the meta thing is like, remember that there's an opportunity here, in the chaos to show your mettle.
Is there space for grief when something like the word grief is thrown around personally quite a bit? Someone passes, there's a issue that happens. Is there like when the postmortem happens, like the logical analysis of why something didn't happen? Do you believe there should be some space to just be like, can everyone just share what's happening? Like, can we just acknowledge this? Is there value in that? I
think there's always value in acknowledging when something sucks.
Yeah.
Like, and maybe another kind of underlying thing here is, for me, I was going to sound dumb, but I hate feeling gaslighted. Like that is like the worst.
Yeah.
If like that is the number one feeling that I cannot handle.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so when you don't acknowledge that something was not great, you are gaslighting yourself or others. And so I think it's actually, I don't know if it's grief per se, because I think different people will will want to rest in that moment in different ways.
Yeah.
But I think an acknowledgement is critical.
Yeah. No, it has to be. So the reason I'm saying that is people are talking about if workplace is really a microcosm for humanity and everything we do, and we're all working together, we're all being together. Is there a place to bring in humanity to a postmortem? Is there a place to just acknowledge at an emotional level what it's like to experience a rollout that didn't go well, a customer that's been pissed, and as a team, can you acknowledge it? And that's an act of slowing down. I don't know if that's even realistic or plausible, but I think it does unlock some deep desire people have, which is a desire for catharsis around something like this. So it's just a thought I've been mulling on.
I love that. That really resonates. The idea of kind of acknowledging that this, doesn't feel good, and that this is a hard moment. Yeah.
Right. Because the lot of evidence, there's like the argument that there's three minds, right? There's the emotional mind, the rational mind, the wise mind. That's one form of understanding humanity. Like it feels like the postmortems, and when I've been at tech or consulting, they're fixated on the rational. They're like, what didn't go well? How are we going to then achieve the next $100 million? It's like, yes, that's definitely an important part. That's why we're hired, but we're also these complex beings. And can there be space for that? It's a question more than anything else.
No, I love it, because I think a lot of managers are scared of showing their own emotions to people. I've definitely seen it where, maybe the manager is frustrated, but they don't want their people to know it. And it comes from a good place, right? They don't want their people to spiral. They don't want their people to be scared. Yeah. So I think there is an art and an importance to showing some of it. Yeah, it's something that I try to do, and I'm not going to throw a temper tantrum in front of my org. But when I am upset, I want to find a way that isn't scary to let them know that I'm upset.
So it's not dissimilar to what you're saying about Trevor Noah and Stephen Colbert, Kat. I think there's something about the realness in which people are showing up that appeals to you. And for whatever it's worth, I don't know if it's possible in the workplace, but I know Steve Kerr, the Golden State Warriors head coach, will throw a clipboard down to demonstrate anger and then use that moment to rally the group together. It may be a exclusively sports territory, but there's something around allowing that to exist. And we may or may not be there in today's workplace, but it's an aspiration. Okay, let me give you the rapid fire, and then I'll ask if there's anything I haven't asked. Rapid fire question. 1, what's the best piece of management or leadership advice you've ever gotten?
Oh, I think it was that thing about your emotions are felt by the people around you, even when you think you're disguising them, even when you think you're doing a good job of hiding them. Everyone else knows.
Can feel it.
Yeah.
What's the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten?
Don't give away all your Legos, because then you'll be irrelevant.
There's still I can go on, but I want to keep this rapid fire. If you had to recommend one fictional book to a new manager, what would it be?
One fictional book. I would say I'm a sci-fi nut. Like, I love sci-fi and fantasy. And so I would recommend Becky Chambers, which is like cozy sci-fi. Her Wayfarer series, it's about a bunch of people on a spaceship. And it's about healthy conflict and healthy dynamics. And it's just a book about a lovely group of people, making a found family on a spaceship. And yeah, I think it just has a lot of like good principles in it.
What do you do to build your resilience? What's like a Cat resilience plan look like?
I definitely think about the stress cycle and reducing the stress that is built up. So that's either, spending time with my partner, or, like hugs, I think are really important, or physical exercise. I think those are both really important things. But I actually think one of the other things is I forget that I have a job on the weekends. Not everyone has that luxury, and I'm sure my boss doesn't love this fact about me, but I literally don't think about it for like 56 hours over the weekend. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, it is. I can tell. No, for sure. No, it's good. It's phenomenal. What's a thing you admire? And maybe you've already answered this question in different ways, but in a leader that you look up to, and who is that leader? What's a thing you admire? They can be pop culture. They can be someone in the workplace.
It's people who are able to take negativity and transform it to constructive, like something constructive. I'm just trying to think if I can think of another good example. Stephen Fry at one point was engaged in some dialogue, some public dialogue with someone from the Catholic Church around HIV and AIDS in Africa. And Stephen Fry is a gay man who is, pro having condoms and all those things. And I was expecting it to be like a come to blows, like yelling situation. And he was so gentle and so like he brought curiosity to that conversation that for me was like a sort of an obvious, there's a right and a wrong here. But he brought the curiosity and the ability to not feel like, well, I'm right and why can't people see that I'm right? And that I thought it's another version of empathy that I was really impressed by.
I think maybe this is why we connect so well, is I think I do similarly follow videos and conversations and tweet threads and feel so inspired by the most subtle moments in time. So I love that example. I'm tempted to go watch that clip at some point. So that's lovely. Here's my last question. Is there a person in your life, personally or professionally, that's made the biggest impact on you that you think inadvertently shows up in how you lead, manage, build teams? It could be a parent, partner, friend, coworker,
Hey, it's a great question. I really struggle with like greatest, like biggest impact type questions.
It could just be one. It could be one. Yeah.
I mean, I've mentioned her a couple of times. I reported to a woman named Mayan Roth for, I don't know, 7-8 years at Flatiron. And so I think that a lot of leadership elements are things that I picked up from her over the years, either intentionally or unintentionally. And I think, even just in sort of leading with a people first perspective, I think that's probably something that she helped kind of build in me in ways that I, can't even like tease apart now.
It's lovely. I love that example. I actually love that it's both unintentional and intentional, because you do pick it up. You pick it up from people you're around, right? Osmosis isn't always it's not just a one way. It's everything. You pick up everything. So appreciate you, Kat. I'll let you go. I know we've gone a little above time, but I couldn't help but ask those last set of questions. I want to close with just an acknowledgement over the impact that you've made on me. And in the last year and a half, two, since we've gotten to know each other, I felt like you've given me an example of what a down-to-earth leader would look like. If there's one word, there's a number of words that would describe you, but it's something that you just strike me as an extraordinarily approachable CTO or CXO of any kind of this huge company. You've kind of maintained a humility and a groundedness that I find to be, it's just a great emulatable trait. So thank you for that, among other things, but I'm grateful for you.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I also think that naming something makes it easier to hold on to. So I appreciate that sort of gift of reflection and like, hey, if this is a thing that I'm doing well, like let me like reflect on that and see how I can nurture that.
Thank you so much for listening to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Mandala for Us Incorporated. My name is Tarun Galagali, your host. If you have any questions or if you ever want to reach out and learn more, I'm at Tarun, that's TARUN at Mandala, MANDALA, FORUS.com, mandalaforus.com. So hope you reach out with any questions you may have. This show is brought to you by Mandala for Us Incorporated and is co-produced by Jim Mendes. I hope you enjoy what you're listening to. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Tarun at mandalaforus.com. Take care.